the presentations, and the second half will be question and answer. Our speakers today are Amaya Atucha and Christelle Guedot, both from UW-Madison Extension, and I will also be here to answer any other questions related to things like disease management. All right, so one more slide before we get to Amaya's presentation. Amaya is going to talk first about post-bloom canopy management, and then we have a short survey for everybody who is in attendance about the format that we've been doing this year with the webinars. Then Christelle will go and talk about Japanese beetles, and then we'll do the Q&A. These are some of the, well, I think it's all of the topics that we've covered in the past two or three webinars. Early season diseases, pesticide application considerations, planting grapevines, weed management, early season insects, and nutrient management. So we have had, I believe, 2 grape webinars before this one. And you can find the recordings of these webinars if you go to YouTube and then go to the U of M Extension Small Farms channel. If you go to a YouTube channel, you see all of the videos that account has made, and you can search and scroll through to find our webinar recordings. And there's a lot of good content on there. We have one more webinar coming up after this one on July 29th at 1 p.m. and we'll be talking about preparing for harvest and managing SWD. All right, I'll have Amaya share your screen now.
Okay, there we go.
Annie, sorry, Annie, make sure to mute yourself because we can still hear the whistling.
All right, well, what I have prepared today is a short presentation about canopy management, mostly focused on post-bloom. Here, at least in southern Wisconsin, I think bloom finished maybe a week ago. That's the state that we are. So I'm going to try to focus, I'm going to do sort of like an overall, talking about canopy management and the different techniques that we have and when to use them. But I'm happy to answer any questions related to specifically about what to do right now at the end, or if you want to start, typing in your questions to the Q&A, that will be great, and then I can address them all at the end. So what's canopy management? When we talk about canopy management, basically we're referring to sort of many techniques that we have to modify the vine canopy with the goals of increasing light penetration inside the canopy that will result on less disease incidents, but also, and most importantly, what I'm going to be referring here to is fruit quality. How can we increase the quality of our grapes? So what are the main canopy management techniques that we can use in the vineyards? The first one, if we look at a calendar year, would be pruning. So balanced pruning to a specific number of nodes for the production that we expect to have the following year, and also in accordance with the age of the vines. So not leaving a lot of nodes, a lot of buds during the pruning, because that is going to ended up being, a very, very dense canopy, and then you're going to have to do way more management during the growing season. So starting with pruning and having the right number of nodes left per vine is really important to set up the stage, not to have to deal with, a big mess during the growing season, trying to do all of the management when there's so many other things happening in the vineyard. The following one will be shoot thinning. We're really past the point of doing shoot thinning right now. Then shoot positioning, we'll talk a little bit about that, leaf removal, and also hedging and skirting. So shoot thinning, as I said, we already are past the point. The timing for shoot thinning is when the shoots are between 4 to 7 inches. That's somewhere between May and the beginning of June, depending on the year. The warmer it is, they'll know the faster those shoots are going to grow. The problem with waiting more time to do the shoot thinning is that it's really easy to snap those shoots out of the sockets. Some varieties tend to do that more than others. So when they are between 4 and 7, it's ideal because you can already see all the shoots that are growing from your cordons and out of the spurs that you left. And so you can start removing them easily. You actually don't even need to have any pruners. You can do it just with your hands. And the objective in this case is to remove a lot of those secondary shoots that come out, especially in very vigorous vineyards. You can see that within one node that's left, a lot of, you can see sometimes two shoots coming, the primary and the secondary, and you always want to remove the secondary because that's the one that is going to have smaller clusters. In the case of cold hardy grapes, we do have a lot of the basal shoots. And so you can see here in this image, there are shoots that are growing from the base of the cordon that are not necessarily what we consider shoots that are coming from count nodes. So these are not buds that we consider when we were doing our pruning. So in that case, those you also want to remove them unless you want to leave them to replace an older spur or a spur that may be creeping and it's getting too long and you want to start a new one from the base. That would be the only reason why I would leave them. In general, you want to remove them. So the density of how many shoots you want to leave per foot of cordon will depend on the cultivars. There's some cultivars that are more vigorous, and my recommendation is to leave more shoots per foot of cordon. Things like La Crescent tend to be a little bit more vigorous. Also things like maybe like Marquette, you want to leave more. So anywhere between 5 to 8. And those varieties that are weaker, that they are not as vigorous, maybe leave less so that you can end up having shoots that are long enough to support the clusters. If you are on a site that is very vigorous, then your vines will be more vigorous as well. And then maybe leaving some more shoots will help absorb some of that vigor. And then you can use another techniques like shoot positioning and leaf removal to open up that canopy. If you are, if your soil in your vineyard is a little bit more sandy and not as fertile, then if you leave a lot of shoots, what's going to happen is that those shoots are not going to grow enough to support those clusters. So in that case, it's advised it's better to leave on the lower end of this range, more between 5 to 4. So it will depend on the cultivar and on your site. So the next thing after the shoot thinning would be shoot positioning, and the timing for this is 1 to 2 weeks after bloom. And the reason for that is that if you do it earlier than that, those shoots are going to be prone to breakage, especially, as I said, things like Marquette are very brittle and it's really easy to snap them. So when you are past bloom, it's easier and they're more manageable. They're easily to bend them and to move them, so you get less of those shoots breaking. That's why we recommend it at this time. What really helps in this case is to have catch wires that you can actually move. They're movable. They're not, you can open them up and put, if you have a high cordon, you can calm your shoots down and insert them into these catch wires. And if you train them in a VSP and your shoots are going up, you can do the same thing. So removable catch wires are really helpful for doing a good job with shoot positioning. After shoot positioning, the next thing that we can do again to open up this canopy and having more light intercept the clusters that are developing is leaf removal. And the timing for this removal is 2 to 3 weeks after bloom, when I always refer to when the berries are about the size of a pea. That's when you can start. A lot of people used to do leaf removal late during the growing season with the objective of increasing light and accelerating the ripening of those clusters. The problem with doing leaf removal very late is that those clusters and those berries have developed in the shade. If you remove a lot of leaves later on, what you're going to have is a lot of sunburn. And so if you do it very early, what I refer early is 2 to 3 weeks after bloom, those berries are just now starting to develop. And if they develop during the entire season or the ripening period, being hit by the sun and exposed by the sun, they're going to develop skins that are thicker, and so they're not going to have any of that cold, any of that sunburn. There's some studies that have been looking at doing leaf removal before bloom. And this is a study that was done in Michigan with vinifera. But one of the things that I thought was very interesting from the work that they did is that the result from doing leaf removal before bloom showed that there was a reduced in the cluster compactness. So in some cultivars, the first one that comes to mind is Petit Pearl. The clusters are very, very, very tight. And when the clusters are really tight, again, you can have more moisture in there, and it could be more conducive to have diseases like sour rot or diseases that had to do with with the fruit being wet and the clusters being wet. So an open cluster allowed more air circulation, and that reduces disease. So that was a very interesting study. I haven't looked at it personally. We haven't done any work with that. We've done this year in Wisconsin a lot of work with leaf removal at the timing that I'm recommending here, 2 to 3 weeks after bloom. But I think that there's an interesting opportunity to look at potential benefits of doing the leaf removal before bloom if you have that problem that you ended up having clusters that are too tight and end up having more fruit rot because of that. So what we recommend is to remove between 3 to 4 leaves around the cluster. So 3 to 4 leaves per shoot where the clusters are, so that you increase the exposure of those clusters to sunlight. So as I said before, we did a study on this. I think we did about 4 years. We did leaf removal 2 to 3 weeks after bloom, and just summary of what we saw during those 4 years. In general, what we saw is a reduction in the titratable acidity of the fruit between 5 to 15%, depending on different cultivars, tend to show more reductions than others. But most of the reduction in the titratable acidity is due to the reduction of one particular acid, the malic acid, was the one that reduces the most. We saw almost no changes in bricks. We didn't see any drop on bricks or increase in bricks. It stayed more or less the same. We did see a positive effect of the leaf removal on phenolic content in red cultivars. We also saw an increase in color development, so more anthocyanins in the grapes and also in the wine that we made afterwards. So all of this translated into the quality of the wine. We saw wines, red wines that were produced with fruit that has been exposed to more sunlight that had a better color stability. And this is something that we're still working on getting to all this data. But one of the last things that we looked at was the development of aroma in wines. And we saw that the wines that were made of fruit that was in the treatment where we did this leaf removal tend to have lower amounts or concentrations of aromas that are associated with green tones, and also increased aromas, compounds, volatile compounds related with rose and fruit. So very positive effect. And so this is something that we highly recommend here in Wisconsin. I've been recommending for many years that leaf removal is something that really pays off, not only on the quality of the grapes, but also it's translated vines that are trained as VSP, and what we recommend is to hedge about 1 foot above the top wire. And the reason for that is we need about 15 leaves per shoot to be able to get those clusters to ripe and have high quality. So you can do 2 things. You can either more or less count 15 to 16 leaves per shoot and then you can hedge, or the same thing would be to hedge about like 1 foot to where your top wire is. We usually recommend this to do, the period of hedging is after bloom, but before veraison. The reason why is that you don't want to leave those really long shoots to droop over the top wire and start shading your fruit. So if you wait until veraison or after that, you have already had a lot of those clusters developing in the shade. That's why you want to do it before that. In the case of skirting, this can be optional when you have a high cordon training system. In some cases, vines that tend to be very vigorous, cultivars that are more vigorous, or vineyards that are established on highly fertile soil will need the skirting. And again, the same premise of the 15 leaves per shoot is also applicable to skirting and hedging. And so you can just either maybe skirt when the shoots already have those 15 leaves and just cut them down, or you can, do a specific certain distance that you want from the ground up. And ideally, you would do this management when you have combed all of your vines and all of the shoots are already in their final position. So I think that's the last slide that I had, and I'm happy to either answer some questions now, or we can wait after. I think that Annie was going to have the poll right now.
So there was one question about canopy management. So let's do that one now. And then I'll launch the poll. The question is, how often should suckers be removed, and how many times per year should I plan to do this task?
Well, that depends. So the thing with the suckers is, and when I'm talking about suckers, I'm referring to the shoots that are coming from the base of the trunk. So that's a really good question. I think that in some years that we have a lot of cold damage, we ended up having a lot of those suckers. So the original advice was always to remove them all as soon as you could. But I think that leaving some of those suckers, as long as they're not, creeping up all the way the vines, could help absorb some of the extra vigor that some of those vines have. So I tend to be more relaxed about leaving them, especially on our vineyards here in our research station. I also think that sometimes you remove them and then you realize that you don't have any new material to renew some of those cordons that might collapse during the growing season. So that is it's a difficult choice to make. I don't think that there's one answer about what to do. If you have a vineyard that has quite a bit of damage, I would let them grow and maybe use them as replacement. If your vineyard looks fine, all of your shoots that you left are growing, you have enough material, and looks like everything is you're gonna have a full crop, then I would totally completely remove it, because it means that you don't have any damage anymore. The later you remove them, I think what happens is that you debilitate a lot the vine by removing them later, because a lot of the suckers have sucked a lot of energy from that vine. So if you remove them, for example, now, I would expect that you would not have a lot of regrowth. If you remove them early on, it might just be that, again, a month after that, you will have new ones growing. So I'm sorry, there's not a clear answer about what to do with them. I think that removing it during this time, right after bloom, it would help you not to have new regrowth from the base of the trunk, if that is your objective.
All right, thank you. There were a few more questions that came in about canopy management relevant to your presentation. I think we're gonna save those until the Q&A, so that'll just be in about 15 minutes or so. So the people who ask those questions, make sure you don't leave. Before Christelle talks about Japanese beetles, we have a short poll. I'm launching it right now, so everybody should be able to see these questions now. We want to get feedback on how you like this format that we've been doing webinars during COVID-19. And thank you to everybody who's been attending these webinars. We want to see if this is something that you like, and determine if we should try to continue something like this past this year. So if you can go ahead and fill out those questions. We'll just take maybe 2 minutes to do this. Looks like we're just waiting for 9 more people to finish up at this point, so that's perfect. A few more seconds. All right, nobody else has submitted answers in a little bit, so we're gonna go ahead with Christelle's presentation. And if you haven't finished filling out those poll questions, they should still be up on your screen, so you can move them over to the corner of your screen to finish answering. Thank you for doing that.
And this is in front of my screen.
The poll?
Yeah.
You should be able to move it somewhere.
I'm gonna try doing that, but then I get everything that comes on top of it.
All right, I will go ahead and end the polling then.
Yeah, that would help, I think.
All right.
It's still in front for me.
You can just click and X out of it now.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so let's see. Okay, so here's my contact. And if you have any questions about Japanese beetle or other insects, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'm the fruit crop entomologist and extension specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So even if you're from another state, don't feel bad about contacting me. And I don't know why this is staying in the front too. Sorry. Trying to move stuff around so I don't have the sharing screen on top of everything. I've never seen that before. Okay. All right, so let me go back because everything is clicking at the same time. I apologize for this. So I just wanted to start by telling you that we had our first detection of Japanese beetle June 10th in La Crosse County, which is very relevant for everybody because that's right at the border with Minnesota. This is the first detection by that cap in Wisconsin. And so that tells me right now that this is maybe a little bit early for Japanese beetle. We usually see them in southern Wisconsin next week by Father's Day, and I'll show you that in the next slide. So just as a kind of a warning is that Minnesota, you might start seeing Japanese beetle already since June 10th as well, and that we might have an earlier year somehow coming up here, and maybe potentially also a heavy year of Japanese beetle with all the moisture we got in the spring, the mild winter we had. It could be the perfect storm, but we shall see. I don't have a crystal ball, so I'm not sure, and time will tell. This is to show you what we've been documenting from 2017 and 2018, as far as that's 20 vineyards in southern Wisconsin, but really throughout southern Wisconsin. And so we really see them usually June 21st, 20th, which is this weekend, Father's Day. And we stop seeing them at the end, the third week or last week of September. And during that entire time, they're laying eggs. So you have to be prepared. You can see that Japanese beetles spend their entire time mating. They also spend their entire time laying eggs. I won't go a lot over the life cycle because that's a lot of information that you can read after when you get the handouts for this. I just wanted to have all that there. But we have only one generation. They can mate multiple times, as we all know. And just so that's interesting is that they lay their eggs about 10 centimeters deep into the soil. And then the larvae, the third instar, go down 10 to 15 centimeter deep. And that's important when you think about winter survival, is that they go deeper, as you can see on this graph here, they go deeper in the winter, about a foot down. So that, not a foot down, half a foot down. And that protects them very well from harsh winters. This is some information that I think is interesting just because we tend to forget that. we always think that they are in the sunny areas and that they're basking in the sun from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Well, when looking at linden trees, studies have found that 80% of them were in the shade by late morning and all afternoon. So we do have a lot that are in the shade. I don't want people to forget. They also feed at night, but their peak feeding is from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. So it's a much broader window than we think about. They play dead when it's lower than 77 Fahrenheit, so they fall to the ground. And above 77, they will fly almost all the time if you disturb them. And at this point, I'll come back to it, but they prefer to lay their eggs in areas that are moist, loamy soil, that have turf, because the larvae feed on the roots of grasses, and in turf that's with a lower cut. And that comes from research from golf courses, because of course there are major pests in golf courses, and the cut of that grass there is really short on putting greens and places like that. And so that's what they prefer. They're less than 1.5 inch tall grass or a turf grass. We all know, don't use monitoring traps. If you want to use them if anything, just use them now to see when they're starting to show up and then get rid of them. That's well known. And scouting is easy for the adults, so there's no need. For larvae, you can do some kind of monitoring for larvae. If you have high infestation levels and that you tend to worry about the grass that you have in your vineyards and around, then you can do a kind of a square foot of soil that you shake through the roots and look for grubs. There's no action threshold, but if you see quite a few in the 1 square foot, if you see 1 or 2, I wouldn't worry about it. But if you start seeing like 10, 20, 30, then you have a heavy larval infestation. So that's something, there's no threshold, it's kind of your comfort level, but I'll talk later about how, what kind of insecticide application you can do. This is a study from my student Jacob Hendon, but we knew that a little bit from some studies, but nothing that was really published. But there is a major edge effect. And you can see on this picture here, we tested the population, assessed the population at the edge, at the center, and midway through at 20 different vineyards. And we do have a lot more Japanese beetle adults at the edge, fewer but not significantly different at the midway point, but fewer significantly in the center of the vineyards. So we know we have an edge effect. Of course, we know that the more adults we have, the more damage we have, and that makes sense. So we also have more damage at the edges. And also when we looked at larvae, we did those kind of soil samples, but we found larvae scattered throughout the entire vineyard. So there was no evident patterns that there were more larvae laid in the edges than in the center of the vineyards. And because we have this edge effect, we were interested in looking at how the percent of cropland around the vineyards may affect the population within a vineyard. And so this is the data in 2017, and you don't see, this is the average number of adults at the vineyards, and then this is the percent cropland in the surrounding landscape. And in 2017, we didn't have any trend that was showing. In 2018, we saw that we have maybe, as the percent cropland increased, more Japanese beetle. But when we combine both of the data, this was very not significant, and this trend even in 2018 was not significant. Now, when we looked at all different factors that could be impacting those Japanese beetle adult populations, what we found is that the further west those vineyards were in Wisconsin, so the more they were towards Minnesota, the fewer Japanese beetle we had, which is very interesting to think about because it's a strong flying insect that's been here since 1916, and yet we still see this pattern of movement where we still don't have as many on the west side of Wisconsin than we do on the east side of Wisconsin. So something to think about, and that's very interesting. By the way, I forgot to mention that we used to say that in Wisconsin, north of Green Bay, pretty much we didn't have any Japanese beetle. DATCAP reported that there is a well-established population in Bayfield, which is all the way north on Lake Superior. So they are everywhere in the state now, maybe with pockets, but they are established pretty much everywhere. So it's a very slow progression, but it's still happening. From a standpoint of cultural control methods for managing them, for larvae, there was a study in Michigan in blueberry where they looked at tilling in the row middles of blueberries. So as you know, they attack blueberries and caneberries as well as 300 host plants. And so what they found here is that this is the average number of larvae per sample, and this is a different time in the season, but they found that they had fewer larvae in the tilled area than in the ryegrass area in those blueberry fields. 72% lower larval densities is what they found. So that was pretty interesting, something to think about. But again, who's going to be tilling completely? So what people have looked at too, I should talk about this. This was for larvae. They also looked at adults, and they had fewer adults on bushes in the tilled row middles. And this was significant in the perimeter, which is what you see down here. So in the perimeter, they had fewer adults in the tilled area than in the grassy area, but that wasn't true for the field interior. So again, there's kind of this disparity between the interior of the field and the edges because of that edge effect that we talked about for grapes, but that is also true in blueberry. Tillage in the spring caused 50% and fall 70% reduction on larval density. So this is something to think about. Removing grass during the egg-laying period. So I mentioned July through September is particularly important if that's what you want to do. And another approach is to cultivate fields after harvest, because that disturbs the grubs that are there that are trying to go and feed before they overwinter. So things that you can think about from a tillage standpoint, or cultivating the fields, if that's what you would want to do in your row middles and around your vineyard. They also looked in Michigan at cover crops as another option compared to tillage. So in this study here, they looked at 4 different kind of treatments. They looked at bare ground as a control, so kind of that nothing growing, buckwheat as a cover crop, clover, or ryegrass. And so this is for adult density, and the overall data here shows that you had significantly more adults in the buckwheat compared to the other treatments, with clover being next, and then ryegrass having the fewest, and bare ground obviously even fewer. But clover and ryegrass were not different from each other. From the larval density, which is interesting, again, the bare ground is the one that has the lowest of everything, right? This is not a good place to lay eggs, and this is not a good place to feed for adults. But the buckwheat then had the lowest numbers of larvae, and clover and ryegrass were kind of intermediate in that. I'm sorry, ryegrass had the highest level of larvae in there. So what's interesting is that what you see here is that it's kind of the opposite between the adult and the larvae. You have the most adult in the buckwheat, but you have the fewest number of larvae in the buckwheat, and vice versa type thing. So it's not clear what would be the best, depending on what it is that you're primarily trying to manage here, whether it's the larvae or the adults or both. There was a study where they, in Wisconsin, where the student Riedmeier looked at different types of mulches, but these were, in this case, you have a control with nothing. We have bark mulch, hardwood chips, rubber mulch, the kind that you have in playgrounds, and just a Roundup, because that was applied on all of the other treatments. And so what he found is that you get a significant reduction from doing nothing and leaving the grass in your row middles. With the bark mulch, it was significantly lower, and even lower with hardwood chips, and then 0 larvae with the rubber mulch. So that's interesting to think about, something to potentially consider. I mentioned that the adults like to lay their eggs in that turf that's about 1.5 inch tall. So cultural control practices that people can apply is withholding irrigation during this adult activity. So maybe irrigating more that turf grass from July into mid-August or so, and then apply that water. and then raising the cutting height of the turf more than 3 inches instead of 1.5 or 2 or something like that, it has been shown to be less attractive for females to lay eggs on. So think about that when you're mowing. To go above 3 inches would help deter some of those females. Just want to say, kind of in passing, but reinforcing that in case you don't know, there's been a lot of different biological control agents that have been looked at for larvae, whether it's the milky spore as bacterial pathogen, fungal pathogen, Bovaria, Metarhizium, nematodes, parasitoid wasps, predators. None of those provide effective biological control at a commercial level. So do not spend your money on that. None of the research has shown that these were actually effective at providing management strategy. Looking at the damage that the adults can do on the leaves, we have this study, and really the bottom line of this study, they caged on different, on grapes, they caged Japanese beetle. They had different density from 0, 10, 20, or 40. And they left them for 2 weeks. And so you can see those kind of cages. These are small plants that have not yet been growing. But when they did this for 2 weeks, even with 40 Japanese beetle caged on those vines, they had less than 7% defoliation after 2 weeks. And that had no effect on plant growth parameters after. So this is on grapes. They also did a study where, to repeat this kind of defoliation, but without having Japanese beetle, they punched holes in these leaves. And so this would represent 10% defoliation, similar to the kind of skeletonizing that Japanese beetle do. This would be 20%, and this is only 30% damage. And what they found is that really when you reach the 30% is when you start seeing a reduced vine growth. If that is applied at bloom, but not at veraison, but they also show a combined effect, so that if it happens at bloom, the vines are then less tolerant at veraison of that damage. But the bottom line of this study is that we're kind of now using this 30% defoliation as a threshold. And if you can look at this closely, you can see that 30% defoliation is quite a huge amount of defoliation. And so our plants can tolerate quite a bit of defoliation through that skeletonization by Japanese beetle feeding without having really any kind of damage on vine growth. So something to keep in mind, that's what we're using for a recommendation for grapes. So this would be kind of the threshold you would use for chemical control for the adults. There are a lot of insecticides that are available for Japanese beetle. You have to keep in mind that you will still get more that come in. So you'll have to reapply. It's quite obvious, but people should all know that. There are different mode of actions or classes here that you can see of insecticides so that you can rotate amongst them. I didn't highlight them, but this Nemix, the insect growth regulator, surround the kaolin clay has also been shown to work pretty well and deter beetles from feeding on leaves. But makes the leaves all white. And then this Bacillus thuringiensis, beetle gone, all 3 of those are organically approved and have a pretty good efficacy and have no pre-harvest interval. The others are all synthetic insecticides and obviously have their different mode of actions and all that, and you would want to rotate. There was a question as we were starting, what can we rotate with 7? And so you have, as you can see here, quite a few options. The pyrethroids are really excellent at controlling Japanese beetle, but even neonicotinoids or organophosphate do a pretty good job, and those organic sprays as well. So hopefully everybody is referring back to the spray guide and also making sure that the products they want to apply are registered in your respective states. Another I mentioned for larvae that you might want to check about now if you have a lot of larvae in your fields. These are the ones that are going to emerge as adults. And what you can do is apply a preventative insecticide, not for these that are going to emerge as adults, but for the new eggs that are going to be laid. So you could apply before July so that it has residual activity. you could apply a neonicotinoid, imidacloprid, cotinidin, thiamethoxam, before July, so that the residues are going to be there for those very young larvae that are the eggs that are going to hatch, and you're going to have those very young larvae that are actively feeding on the roots. You want to water those in so that the products go to the roots where those larvae are going to start feeding. Admire Pro has been shown in Michigan. They applied that in late June on grassy field perimeters in blueberry, and they show a reduction under Japanese beetle adults on the bushes for about 2 weeks. But then new beetles came in, and that kind of drowned out the effect that this insecticide application had at that time in late June. But it is still something to think about from a standpoint of an IPM program early in the season. I mean, early by that, I mean now, at the end of June. And that's all I have.
Great, thank you. We'll try to take the questions for both presentations now in the order in which they came in for the most part. I'll actually turn my video on to here. But before we do that, I think there's one question at the end that's just a quick clarification question for Christelle. Just to confirm, you said the beetle is more prevalent on the eastern side of Wisconsin than the western side, correct?
Yes.
All right.
Did I say, maybe I mix up my
that's what you
all the time.
No, that's what you said.
Okay, good.
However, we still have plenty of Japanese beetles in Minnesota. So that's interesting.
We still have some. You just have fewer than we do probably in Eastern.
Okay. All right. So first question was during Amaya's presentation. Your presentation seems focused on VSP trained vines. I would think there would be some differences when using TWC,
high wire cordon?
high wire cordon, such as skirting or hedging. First, could you just review what you mean by skirting? Because I think not everybody's familiar with that term. And then what are the differences when we're talking about these?
Oh, okay. Well, sorry, I thought that everybody was familiar with that. So skirting is basically when where you're training your vines in a high wire cordon in which the shoots are going in the down direction and they touch the ground and they start growing over the alleyway. You want to also cut them, and that's what skirting means, like wearing a skirt basically. And hedging is the opposite. Is when you have a VSP and the shoots are growing up, you just cutting them once they are like a foot above the top wire, so that they don't droop and they fold over the fruit zone and start shading them because they're just too long. So that's the difference. So in terms of canopy management difference for VSP and high cordon, we do pruning, the same recommendation. It doesn't matter. Unless some people used to leave spurs that are a little bit longer in high cordon. Instead of leaving 2 nodes, they would leave 3 nodes. I don't think that makes a huge difference. In terms of thinning, the recommendations of the number of shoots per foot is the same whether you're doing high cordon or VSP. In terms of leaf removal, we also do leaf removal in high wire cordon. So we have had in that study, our Petite Pearl was in a high wire cordon, and we also did the leaf removal and we saw the same benefits. Even though there's some information that showed that high wire cordon tends to have more light penetration into the fruit zone than when you have a VSP in cold climate grapes. But still, it still benefits, and we saw the same positive effects that I summarized on that slide on the high wire cordon trained vines than on the VSP ones. Then for shoot positioning, whether you're combing them, which is you're pushing them down when you have a high wire cordon, or you are positioning and getting them to go up and into the catch wire, that's shoot positioning on both types of training systems. And then the only big difference is that you would hedge on the top for the VSP and you would skirt in the high cordon. Now, if you have a Scott Henry or a double canopy in which you have half of the canopy going up and half of the canopy going down, in that case, we've seen the majority of the time we don't either have to skirt or to hedge, because we have so many shoots that the vine is much more calm and those shoots don't grow so much. So we really kind of absorb all that vigor by having more shoots.
Okay, thank you.
Can I make a quick comment?
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to say, if you have questions for the group, for everyone, it's better to type that in the chat than in the Q&A, because I don't think everybody goes to the Q&A or maybe sees in the Q&A. So if you have questions, like there's somebody that was asking, and now I forgot, deer damage. Are you seeing deer damage on your young vines? If you want people to pitch in, put that in the chat. That's what I suggested. And there was another question too that, oh yeah, Greg Statch is saying, has anyone observed decent Japanese beetle control when wild turkey flocks and heavy bird pressure are present in the vineyard? Will they even eat Japanese beetle? So if you want other people to pitch in, I mean, we can talk about that, but other people might want to say something about that in the chat.
All right. Also, you guys have been quiet so far in the chat box, so this is a great opportunity to get your questions answered because there aren't too many coming in today. Concerning leaf removal, my trellises are oriented a bit southeast to northwest, meaning the south and west side of the trellis receives more light time than a traditional north and south trellis system. Do I need to be concerned with the amount of leaf removal I do on the south or west side because of the amount of light?
No, what you need to be concerned, and this is for everybody, is when you're doing that leaf removal. If you do it early on, it doesn't matter if one side tends to have a little bit more sunlight than the other. What matters is that if you do it late, those skins on the berries will have developed in the shade and they're going to be thinner. And when you pull those leaves later in the growing season after veraison, you will have damage. If you do it early on, it doesn't matter if your rows are not perfectly oriented north-south and you tend to have a side that has more sun. It won't affect them. It won't damage them at all. So you don't have to customize it.
Okay. Has anyone observed decent Japanese beetle control when wild turkey flocks or heavy bird pressure are present in the vineyard? And will they even eat Japanese beetle?
I'm sorry. Say that again.
It was about the question with Japanese beetles and turkeys. Will turkeys and heavy bird pressure eat Japanese beetle?
They will eat, I'm sure, Japanese beetle, but to the point of seeing anything that would be good control option, I don't know. That's why I was saying put that in the chat so that people can see that and maybe have answers. I know I have growers, grape growers, that have chickens and say that the beetles will jump into the grapes and pick at the Japanese beetle. But to the point of them providing control and not confusing your grapes later on with your Japanese beetle, that's another question.
Somebody asked, is anyone having deer damage yet this year? They seem to like the new growth. So that's something where she's wanting input from anybody who's on here. So feel free to type in the chat box to answer that question. If what's your deer damage been like? In the meantime, Matthew's asking, how are the Wisconsin and Minnesota grape crops looking so far this year, just in general? I get a lot of questions from grape growers in Minnesota this time of year around drift, herbicide drift, as well as phytotoxicity, where phytotoxicity means whatever you're spraying is having a toxic effect on the vines. So that's what I've been answering a lot of questions about lately, which makes it seem like things aren't going well, but I think it is going well because it seems like I'm not having a lot of people come to me and say that their crops are having a lot of issues. It seems like the vineyards that I'm getting pictures from and the few that I have been able to visit with the COVID restrictions seem to have good crops so far, pretty good crop load. I have, however, seen some vineyards that still have carryover damage from the 2019 polar vortex. So I have heard from a few places that say that just bud break didn't really occur, or bud break occurred really late from some damage. And I think that some of this damage was carryover from 2019. Some of the damage, however, was from that mid-May freeze that we got. So especially for younger vines, we're talking about younger ones that just didn't have as much energy to pop back well from that freeze. Those are the ones that seem to be having more issues, and additionally vineyards that are in lower lying areas. But I think that these issues are relatively few. It's just that that's what I get questions about. So it seems like things are going relatively well as far as crop load. And in Minnesota, most vineyards at this point are exiting bloom, and we're getting into the post-bloom time.
Yeah, things that I would say similar here in Wisconsin. What we see in Madison, in our vineyards, the crop looks great this year. It has been really dry, which has helped quite a bit, which brings me to the topic of irrigation. If you're establishing new vines, I think that this is a year where everybody should be really concerned about irrigation. We have planted several new blocks of vineyards, and we've had to irrigate them. I think that at least 5 times already. I want to continue to irrigate them. That's huge for the success of newly planted vines, is to keep irrigation. Just remind growers that new vines need to have small root systems, small volume of roots, and so that means that the amount of soil that they're occupied is small and it dries really fast. So think about, if you don't get good precipitation, then you will have to supplement if you want to make sure that you're getting that you will get a good growth this year. In terms of the carryover effect of the polar vortex of 2019, that's true. One of the things that we've seen a lot, as we were talking about, was the suckers. That's another a result of that. I think that last year, maybe in some vines that were damaged, the crop was less, so the vines were able to sort of like still develop last year and be able to grow. But if this year you are heavily cropping them, it might just be that you're going to see some vines collapse because they're not going to be able to maintain all of that heavy crop if they still have some damage carrying over from 2019. We see a lot of that in other fruit crops, that things are collapsing this year because last year there was not a lot of crop in them. There was not a lot of fruit. And so they were able, to survive less growing season. But this growing season, when we're trying to crop them heavily, that's when the vines and the trees are starting to collapse. So that's another thing that I've gotten several emails about.
And Jim said we had 3 really cold nights last November, and I don't think the vines had time to harden off. Plus the cold May, I've lost several Edelweiss vines. Yeah, so that's something that I forgot to mention here, but wrote about in this article a couple weeks ago that I just put in the chat box about potential reasons why vines might have failed to break bud this year. We did get cold at the beginning of November for, about 3 nights, like you're saying. And it was way colder than normal. And so that probably did impact things in some cases.
So what is the range that you're talking about when you said that it was way colder in November than what you would expect?
I think I said it, or I included like a weather map or something in that article, I'm pretty sure. I don't remember the numbers exactly.
Because one of the things that we've seen in my lab with some of the work that we've done in cold hardiness for these grapes is that they actually are pretty hardy by November. Surprisingly,
we were
much
still
more than what we expected.
Okay, we were still harvesting a lot of Frontenac right at the end of October.
We rarely see damage here in Wisconsin in the fall.
Okay. So I'm showing to answer your question, the weather maps that I included in the article. I have one that was the average minimum temperatures from November 5th to November 15th. And the minimum temperatures in Minnesota got down to between 5 and 15 degrees Fahrenheit. And then I did a map of the departure from the average. So how does this compare to the average? And throughout a lot of Minnesota, that is about 10 to 15 degrees below the average minimum temperature for that time of year. Wisconsin is somewhat included in those maps as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I don't know if that helps answer your question. Do you feel like that is cold enough to do some damage?
I don't have the data right here with me, but I would say that the analysis that we do, we start doing DTAs for doing bud hardiness analysis starting around October. And by November, we can already see that they're hardier than 5 Fahrenheit.
Okay.
They're able to withstand that.
All right. Awesome. Okay, so another question we got is, how do you tell the difference between primary and secondary shoots for removal?
That's a very good question. So I hope that everybody can see my video. So if this is your cordon, these are my kids' color pencils. The primary bud is gonna come out in a 45 degree, okay? That's a primary. The secondary one is gonna come on a 90 degree perpendicular to the cordon. That's how you know the difference. So if this is your spur and your spur is like this, going up, your primary is going to come up on a 45 and your secondary is going to come up on a 90 degree. Does that make sense? So that's how you can know the difference. If this is your spur, if they say, here's your cordon, you're training it as a VSP, and this is your spur going up, 45 degrees with the cordon is going to be the primary, 90 degrees perpendicular to is going to be the secondary. And obviously the same if you are training them down, will be like this. That make sense? I don't have a picture with me, but that's the difference.
Nice.
So anything that is coming 90 degrees from your spur is a secondary.
Okay, so let's say a scenario where somebody has VSP vines and the cordons were established the previous year. So you're establishing your spurs on that cordon for the first time.
Yeah.
Should you pick the secondaries because they're nice and vertical, or should you pick the primaries because they might be more fruitful?
The regular thing that would happen is that you should have only primaries. So if the cane that you lay to be your cordon is healthy and there's no damage, it's the primaries that should come out. Now, if you have both of them, I will remove the secondary and leave the primary.
Okay. It might be tempting for some people to leave the secondary because it's going up vertical. So yeah, this is helpful.
But the primary is going to give you more fruit.
Yep, yep. All right, has anyone had Somerset seedless cordons and canes die back unexpectedly when they seemed fine with green insides when pruning?
That could be, again, the result of cold damage. The canes could be fine, but the buds might be dead. So the canes are more cold hardy than the buds itself. So it's in many cases when you have cold damage, it not just happen that your buds are dead, but your canes are still alive. That's when you get sometimes some basal nodes that can start breaking from the canes itself. So yeah, that is possible.
I saw quite a lot of that this year. And it was especially common with the younger vines or cordons that had just been established the previous year. From what I saw, it seemed to be more common that the buds that weren't breaking were further along towards the end of the cordon versus at the base of the cordon. And I mean, that makes sense because if you're establishing a new cordon, right, the part at the end is going to be younger because it had less time to develop.
So if you're laying the cane, the tip of the cane that's going to be your cordon would also be the last part to harden to produce bark. So the bark, when you start seeing the bark on those shoots, it always starts from the base all the way to the tip. So that makes sense that in that case, especially if you have maybe a fall that is very cold, as some of you were saying that happened in Minnesota, that those tip of the shoot that was going to be your cordon that you were going to lay did not harden fast enough and then you already had the damage there.
So one of the reasons why we tell people when you're laying down a new cane, or you're laying down a cane to be a new cordon, don't lay down the whole thing at once, because you have weak wood, really, it gets really skinny at the end. And so that weak wood is probably not going to become a strong cordon. You should really establish a cordon in a couple of phases.
Yes,
Ken
I
says,
agree with that.
Awesome. Ken says we are in the third day of 40 to 50 mile an hour winds. The vineyard is taking a beating here in west central Minnesota. Any suggestions for broken vines or cordons?
Oof, that's a tough one. We've seen a lot of winds, but not a lot of damage. I would say this is where it's important to have very well secure cordons. I go to many vineyards that I see that those cordons are not properly attached to the wires, and that exacerbates if you have a lot of wind that is going to produce more damage. But if you already have, I mean, if there's nothing that you can do about it, I don't have any particular suggestion. I would say if it's windy and warm and there's no rain, having dehydrated shoots may also make them more sensitive to breakage. So irrigating would be a thing that I would suggest.
I know nobody asked, but I want to say this anyway, as far as diseases, we weren't really spraying for botrytis before bloom, but now we're in post bloom. So it's time to make sure that you're spraying for botrytis at this point in time. Just because you're not seeing botrytis until the grapes are ripening doesn't mean you shouldn't be spraying for it now, because those fungi are reproducing on the vines right now. And so it's important to make sure that you're including chemistries in your fungicide program that are effective on those. And again, you can go to the Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide or the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide to find out which fungicides are effective on botrytis. Don't assume that what you are currently spraying is going to be effective on it. Make sure you're double checking those tables and making sure you're hitting all the diseases we need to hit. All right. Is there anything else?
I think that's it.
All right.
That's it for me too.
Okay. And yeah, thank you to the Wisconsin Grape Growers Association, by the way, for helping us get the word out on these webinars. We appreciate that. So yeah, we have one more coming up on July 29th. Hope to see everybody there. And thank you for attending today.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Bye,
Bye.
Annie. Thanks.